let me demonstrate how I'm using Lightroom's masking tools to target specific areas of an image and thus turn this raw file into this final image, making it much more dramatic. As always, you can follow along this tutorial by downloading the raw files. You can find a link in the description of this video. And now let's begin. Since we are working with an HDR panoramic image, that means we first, of course, need to merge it. Therefore, select all the images of the HDR panoramic sequence down below, then right-click on one of the thumbnails, go to Photo Merge and choose HDR Panorama. After a quick moment, Lightroom will present you the HDR Panorama Merge preview like this. There are a few things we can change, however I'm just going with the cylindrical projection method. I'm not changing anything else. Once you set this up, just hit the Merge button. This, depending on your system, will take a while.
One eternity later.
Finally, we will end up with this image, which we will now crop. So the most important thing about the cropping for this image is to keep the subject centered. This will create a more pleasing composition, so I'm going to take away a big chunk of the image from the right side. I'm also going to take away a bit from the bottom. I don't want to cut these rocks, so I'm very careful cropping around this area. Also, I'm going to take away a bit from the sky and a little bit more from the bottom part. Alright, this is looking pretty good. Now, before we're heading into the interesting masking part, we always want to have the base image nicely prepared for the masking stuff. So I'm going to start this by changing the profile from Adobe Color to Adobe Standard to lessen the overall contrast just a little bit. Then I'm going to bring down the exposure, which will make the whole image darker. But since I know I'm going to target very specific areas later on to brighten up the image, I can safely bring down the overall exposure. I'm also going to bring down the highlights, which will especially make the sky darker. And then I'm going to bring up the whites. I'm doing this to kind of spread the histogram, adding some more contrast right at this point. Now, looking at the histogram, you can see there is a bit of overexposure right in the brightest part of the clouds. I don't think it matters much. Also, I'm going to adjust this area specifically with a bit of masking later on. So for now, I want to leave this overexposed part in the image. Then I want to add texture, which will sharpen the image slightly. I'm also going to add clarity, which will affect the midtones. And I'm going to reduce the haze to add some soft glowing look on top. Just like this. Perfect. And finally, we want to push the vibrance a bit so we end up with a colorful image. Alright, perfect. Let's compare to before real quick. You can see exposure wise it's looking much darker. This also means the overexposure is mostly gone, but we're lacking some interesting light in the landscape of this scene. And that's the part where masking becomes very important. So let's go ahead, open up the masking panel. And my idea for this shot is I want to kind of darken most of the edges and corners of the image and thus lead the viewer's eye towards the subject in the center and make the subject stand out. I can add light on the green patches in the grass. I can also create shadows for the foreground and shadows for the top part of the sky. So let's start with the easiest thing we can do, making the foreground darker. I'm going to use a simple linear gradient. I'm going to drag one up like this, holding down the shift key so it stays even. And I actually don't want to affect that much of the foreground. So I'm going to create a very soft linear gradient. And what I'm going to do now with this mask setup, I'm going to bring down the exposure, introducing more darkness on this specific area. Just like this. We can further tweak the position of this mask until we get something that looks pleasing to us. Wonderful. I can deactivate the mask so you can see the difference from before to after. And immediately you can see how we are creating light and shadows with the use of very simple masks. I can create a similar effect for the sky. So let's use another linear gradient. Using this linear gradient, I'm going to be covering pretty much all of the sky like this. And what I'm going to do here is to again bring down the exposure and thus make those clouds look much darker. I'm also going to add a little bit of contrast just to bring out the cloud structure some more. But that's about it, and it looks much better already. Again, let me deactivate this mask from before to after, and you can now get an idea how I'm focusing the viewer's eye more on the center by making the outer parts of the image darker and much more dramatic this way. The sky now looks kind of dangerous with something like an approaching thunderstorm in the distance. What I personally like to do for adjustments like these is to stack multiple differently sized linear gradients on top of each other. That means I can create another one for the top part of the sky, just affecting the upper right corner of that cloud, and again bring down the exposure a little more in this particular spot. This helps create a more natural looking gradient from bright to dark in the sky. Just like this. Wonderful. I actually think I want to add one more linear gradient covering the very top part of the sky, roughly like this. And let's bring down the exposure one more time. Perfect. I'm really happy with how this is looking. Let's create light coming in from the top left corner of the image, because that's where the clouds are the brightest. So it makes sense to use a radial gradient as our light. Let's make it nice and big. And of course we want to rotate it to fit the direction of the light. And I'm going to place the center somewhere outside of the image. And I'm going to make it a little bigger actually. Let's also make it a little thicker. And what I'm going to do to create this light coming in from this corner is I'm going to bring up the blacks. I'm also going to bring down the dehaze. Alright, that looks good already, but what else we can do is to bring up the exposure just a little bit for some extra light. And right at this point you can see the overexposure is getting to a point where it looks ugly. So what I'm going to do to prevent that is to bring down the highlights, and we get back details in the clouds this way. Wonderful. Let me deactivate this radial gradient real quick so you can see the difference from before without the light effect to after. And now we have this very subtle light coming in from the top left corner of the image. Perfect. Now these masks were quite simple. Let's try something a little more advanced. So let's create a new mask and let's choose Select Object right here. Make sure the rectangle select mode is activated by clicking on this icon, and now let's draw a rectangle around our subject. This will give us a pretty good selection. You could probably also use the Select Subject mask, but I just prefer using the Objects mask for this. Now we want to make the subject stand out, make it more visible. And how can we do that? That's really easy. We add contrast. That means in the distance we have some dark mountains, so the subject needs to be a little brighter to stand out. So what I'm going to do is to bring up the exposure just a little bit. We really don't want to overdo it. I'm also going to increase the whites, which will make the jacket brighter. And I'm going to push the saturation because I really like the color of that jacket. Alright, that helped tremendously already. Let me deactivate the Objects mask to see the difference from before to after. Much better. At this point we are missing some light in the foreground. And that's where a color range mask is super useful. Right here in the foreground you can see a lot of green color tones which we can target. So let's create a new mask, choose color range. And with the color range I'm just clicking right in here. This gives us a great selection for all the green tones in the foreground. But I don't want to change everything in the foreground the same. For example, we have added a linear gradient right here to make it darker. So it doesn't make sense to now go ahead and make this area brighter again. We want to mask this out. So I'm going to click on Subtract and let's choose Brush. I'm going to brush away a part from this area. And I'm also going to brush away a part from the left side. And what I'm doing now is I'm going to create light by increasing the exposure. This is really simple. As you can see, I bring up the exposure slider and we will get this awesome light effect. So let's bring it up a little more like this, and I'm also going to bring up the whites. Now the thing with these color range masks is sometimes it looks a little bit strange. You can see it in this area right here. The reason is the color range mask doesn't cover everything that needs to be covered. To fix that, I'm going to click on the color range and I'm going to use the refine slider to bring it up a little bit. So that's looking much better. But I want to further work on this effect. I'm going to use another color range mask, and I'm going to click right in here in the brightest parts of the green colors of the foreground. Then I'm going to say subtract, choose linear gradient. I'm going to subtract in such way that only this ridge right here will be selected. We don't want this mask to affect the foreground or the left side. So I'm going to subtract another linear gradient, taking away a part from the left. Just like this. And what we are going to do with this selection is once more bring up the exposure to improve this light effect and make it stronger in this particular area. Just like this. Perfect. I think I want to make this effect even stronger, but let me show you a different way of targeting the green tones. I'm going to use a radial gradient and I'm going to create one over the area which I want to affect. So right here. Now obviously we are targeting way more than the green color tones, so we need to change that. How can we do that? That's really simple. Hover over the mask, click on the three dots, choose intersect mask width, and now we're choosing color range. With the color range eyedropper, click in the green area of the image, and just like that we get a perfect selection for the area we want to adjust. So again, I'm going to bring up the exposure, and as I said earlier, by stacking multiple masks on top of each other, we get this really cool effect. We can do the same on the left side. I'm going to use another radial gradient and I'm choosing the brightest green tones of the left side. Right around here maybe. Then again, hover over the mask, click on the three dots, choose intersect mask width and choose color range. Then click in the green area, and this is how we get the perfect mask. Again, let's bring up the exposure. Wonderful. Now what about the mountains in the background? Let me use another color range mask for this. With the color range eyedropper, click in the mountain in the back, and we want to kind of bring down the refine slider to get a more precise mask. Still, it's far from perfect, but what we can do as well is we can subtract a radial gradient from the bottom part, and I'm doing this because I don't want to make this area around the subject darker, because then we will lose contrast between the mountains in the back and the subject in the foreground. Also, I'm going to say subtract linear gradient to get rid of everything selected in the foreground. Let's subtract a brush and also get rid of things selected on the left side and the sky. Just like that. Okay, now what I want to do in here is to just bring up the contrast a little more, adding some more punch. We can further improve this effect, therefore let me use a radial gradient. I'm going to pretty much cover just the dark mountains in the distance like this. But again, we don't want to affect the subject. So let's click on subtract, choose object, and let's draw a rectangle around our subject. This will nicely cut out the subject standing on the rock. Plus, I also want to subtract a radial gradient to take away that area in the bottom half of the mask above. Maybe let's also subtract a linear gradient just to be safe. Alright, so with this mask, I once more bring up the contrast. I'm also going to drop the shadows to add more darkness to the image. And what else works really good for mountains like this is to bring up the clarity. Now, as I bring up the clarity, focus on those tiny rivers in the distance, as they become more visible as I bring up the clarity. This looks wonderful. What about the lake in the center? At this point, it's really dark and it's kind of going under with everything else going on in this image. We can target that as well. Let's create another color range mask and with the eyedropper click in the lake. Obviously this will select way more than needed, so we can make use of the refine slider once more and bring it down. So that's looking pretty good. Still, we have more things selected than needed, so I'm once more going to make use of that intersect feature. Hover over the mask, click on those three dots, choose intersect mask width and choose brush. And all I need to do now is to brush over the lake to get a perfect selection. Now we can make the lake brighter by bringing up the exposure. We can also bring up the whites. Then I'm going to drop the temperature, which will make the lake a little colder. And I'm also going to bring up the saturation just to make it pop a little more. Now let me deactivate this particular mask to see the difference from before to after. Much better. Finally, there is one more thing I want to change, and that's this thing the person is standing on. I'm going to use a radial gradient, and let me just cover this rock like this. Now I'm going to say subtract and choose color range. Click in the lake because we don't want to change the lake. We want to change the rock. And I'm also going to say subtract object because we don't want to select the subject. Perfect. To get a very clean selection, I'm going to say subtract, choose a brush, and I'm going to brush away everything else that's selected besides that rock. Okay, what I want to do in here is to add some more contrast. I'm also going to bring up the highlights, which will make this rock just a little more visible. I'm also going to bring up the whites for the same effect. And then let's add some clarity to add some more punch. Perfect, this looks great. And at this point we are done with the masking adjustments of this image. Now that was quite a bit, but let's compare the image to before. This was the image with the basic adjustments applied. And here we have the image with masks applied, which looks much more dramatic now, thanks to very targeted adjustments. Now all that's left to do is a little bit of color grading. So let's continue. I'm going to do the color grading in the color mixer. And what I want to do first is to change the hue of the aqua color tones. So I'm going to bring down the slider. This will affect the jacket a little bit. Alright, I don't want to overdo it, just change the colors up a bit. I'm also going to head into the saturation tab. I want to bring up the yellow saturation, which will affect the grass in the foreground. I'm also going to bring up the green saturation for the same effect. Then let's bring up the aqua saturation to make the subject pop a little more. And I'm also going to bring up the blue saturation just a little bit. Okay, now we can enhance the contrast a little more by making use of luminance. What this means is we can, for example, bring up the yellow luminance, and since the foreground mostly consists of yellow tones, this yellow luminance slider will affect the foreground. So I'm going to raise it, and thus we're making the foreground brighter, improving this artificial light effect. Perfect. I'm also going to bring up the aqua luminance, which will make the subject pop a little more. And let's maybe also bring up the blue luminance for the same effect. Wonderful. That's it for the color mixer. Now there's a bit more color grading going on in the calibration tab. Here I'm always just playing around until I find something that looks great. Usually I start by bringing down the blue primary hue. So right around here, and I'm going to bring up the saturation because I want this image to be colorful. I'm also going to bring up the green primary hue, and let's bring up the red primary hue as well. Perfect. Then I do think I want to bring up the saturation here a little more, but that's about it. Okay, now the only thing left to do in Lightroom is the sharpening in the details tab. So let's do that real quick. I'm always applying the same settings. I'm going to bring down the radius all the way. I'm going to increase the details all the way up. Then I'm holding down the Alt key and adjust the masking slider. This way we can see where the sharpening will be applied. And of course we want the subject to get a little sharper. So right around here looks great. Then let's bring up the amount of sharpening. And we are done. So that's the finished image. There are a few things I want to fix in Photoshop, mainly this gap right here at the top due to the merged panorama. And I'm also going to clean up those 4 sensor spots. I'm not going to include this in this video because that's not that interesting. But otherwise, I hope this video was helpful and interesting. If you want to add anything or if you have any questions left, let me know in the comments, and thank you so much for watching this video.